really. They are philosophies. They're philosophies. And
people worship them, and they become like fanatics. And you're right, they get this religious zeal around these ideologies. And that's why things get so hot and so fired up, and it's so hard to even engage in debate sometimes.
Yes, and that's actually the key to classical liberalism, was to try to solve that problem. Because one thing that I think a lot of people don't realize, is that everyone has a religion. You don't have to have a God, but you are going to have a religion. We are, as human beings, we have to have a religious software running our system. It's our way of looking at the world, of what is right and what is wrong, how I should spend my time, how you should be spending your time, whether I can take your stuff or not and redistribute it. All of those are driven by your moral software. And I'm not talking about any particular religion. It's like that. That is how we run. We determine as human beings what is right and what is wrong. We might get it from somewhere else. We might make our own version of it, but we all have a religion. Everyone has a religion. And all legislation is the legislation of morality. People say you can't legislate morality. It's like, no, actually, law, that's all it is. Law is the legislation. It is codifying moral standards. That's what it is. Don't cheat. Don't, break your contracts. Don't kill people. Those are moral statements codified into law. So like religious, traditionally religious people, deistic religious people, are often criticized for trying to incorporate their religion into the political spheres. Like, that's actually what everyone does. Everyone is trying to have law recreated in their own image, the image of their religion, whatever that religion happens to be.
Gentlemen, welcome to the Be the Man podcast. I'm your host, Greg Denning. Gary and I are friends from a long time back, and the first time we met was in the wilderness. We were in the backcountry of Yosemite. And then since then, we've had a lot of great conversations, a lot of great interactions. And whenever we get together, it's usually in the wilderness, which I love. Like, my memories with Gary are either around books and great discussions, or in the wilderness, or both. And we just had one recently. We were back in the wilderness in Zion's, and he and I were hiking out of this big canyon, and we're just talking philosophy and books and life, and it was awesome. So I'm like, man, I've got to have him on the show. So Gary, welcome, brother, and introduce yourself, give a background, and then let's dive in. Like, you have this mission and this message you want to share, and I want you to share that with our audience here.
Thanks, Greg, and thanks for having me. I grew up in Southern California. I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm a disciple, I'm an educator, and I'm an armchair or amateur I'm a student, a student of trying to understand this world that we live in, trying to understand the pursuit of human happiness and prosperity, trying to understand what is the formula for the best, that we can experience as human beings. Trying to understand that from a philosophical perspective, from a practical perspective. And so that's kind of what has led me into a personal journey that led me to read the books, that led me to have conversations with you. And that's kind of how I got into it. But I started out as an IT professional. That was my professional background in college. And then I discovered, when my oldest child was like 5 or 6, that there was this whole world besides just technical knowledge of how Western civilization came to be, and how it has done more to end poverty and slavery and illiteracy and all these things. Like, I never learned about that. I mean, I did get one little piece of, Plato's Allegory of the Cave, one little tiny section in high school, but that was it, that was it. And so since then I've been on that was, 20 plus years ago. Since then, I'm just trying to understand the formula for human success and prosperity and happiness.
Well, what's made you different? Because I think we all have a little bit of exposure here and there, and you think, oh, that's interesting, or I'd like to learn about that someday. What made you different? What? Because I know you're one of the most well-read people I know. You love to read and study and think and talk about this stuff. What's the difference? Why did you chase it? Why are you still chasing it? Because you have a career, you have a family, like you're a busy guy. What makes a difference?
I think we can all feel driven to something. I feel driven to this. Besides being out in the wilderness, I feel driven towards this. When I'm not doing work or family or wilderness, this is what I do. Is what I feel. I feel called to it, I guess, in a sense. I don't know where it will lead, but I feel driven to understand and explore this thing called human happiness and flourishing, human flourishing, because I feel like there are competing philosophies out there. Some that have that make big promises and haven't delivered, but they're very enticing. And so how do we steer our children? My children are what got me into this. My oldest was struggling in school in first grade. And so I wanted to understand why, because I didn't really have a great K-12 experience myself. I struggled too. And I'm like, I want to have him have a better experience than I did. And so that led us to exploring lots of different educational venues. I jumped out of the IT world, started my own school, the whole story there. I went and joined another, university where I got a master's degree, and I'm now working for a third school. So I've been in education now for nearly 20 years, trying to provide a different kind of education that I hope will answer some of these questions and provide some of these insights to young people in their young years. That I don't feel like that I got when I was in school.
Same, man. Not even close. In fact, it was after university that I finally got exposed. I'm like, this is what's possible. This is what's available. Why is this not being taught?
Yes,
it's killing
exactly.
me. And again, it's a lifetime. Right? I know you're a voracious reader. I still average a book a week and have for over 2 decades, and I feel like I think I'm getting to the base, maybe a foundation of the beginning of an education.
Yes.
After all these years,
yes.
I feel like, oh, there's so much I don't know. But let's dive in. Well, share pre-recording here. I asked Aaron, like, what's the mission? What's the message? Share that with us, and then let's dive into those fundamentals and those conflicting philosophies that we're seeing. That you're so right. Like on the surface, they look so good. They feel so good. And I think even have short-term results, but long-term outcomes are catastrophic, at least from my perspective.
So I started a blog and a podcast a couple of years ago, called Culture Stack. And the reason I came up with that name is I'm from a technology background. There's this technology stack is the idea. Is like, what's in your server? What hardware are you running? What operating system are you running on that? What applications are you running on top of that? It's like there's this stack. And I've realized that our society has a stack as well. Every society has a stack, and you can look at that stack and you can tell where it's going to go, or you can look at each part of the stack. So, for example, every society starts out with a moral foundation. You can't get away with it. It doesn't have to be deistic. It can be non-deistic, but you have prophets, poets, or philosophers who espouse a certain moral ethic or tradition. Again, doesn't have to be deistic. Marx was not deistic. He did not, but he's a philosopher, and in many ways a poet and a prophet. So Moses, Jesus Christ, Muhammad. You have all these individuals who espouse a certain. This is the way the world is supposed to be. This is, if there's a heaven and an earth, this is how they relate. The evil, good and bad, right and wrong, the shoulds of life. That's the moral foundation. And every society, you can go back and drill down into that. And resting on top of that is a political layer. So you've got moral and then political. And political is founded by statesmen who are people who read those philosophers, those poets, those prophets, and say, we need to formalize that morality into a legal system to help perpetuate that, help make that thing happen. So, for example, you see on the Supreme Court of the United States, you've got Moses up there with his tablets. That's a really good example of how, like the U.S. founders, they took the Judeo-Christian, Greco-Roman tradition and built a political layer on top of it. So the U.S. founders would be examples of statesmen. Stalin, Lenin would be statesmen on top of a Marxist layer, for example. They took what he wrote and built nations around it, and political systems and legal systems. So politicians work within that system, but statesmen are the one who create them. So you've got the moral.
And it can go, like, just to emphasize here, it can go either way. It can go really well, or it can go wretched.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the layers are still there regardless.
Exactly. The layers are there, and they go really good or really bad, usually really bad.
Yeah.
It seems like in history.
Yeah.
But you can always break them down, and you can go and inspect them. On top of that, you've got the economic layer. What is the economic engine? What is the economic philosophy? So capitalism, for example, you've got Adam Smith, for example, that is built on top of or influenced by the moral and political layers underneath it. So capitalism under an American stack is going to look different than capitalism under a communist China stack, because they have capitalism over there too. But you'll often hear people conflating, we need to get rid of capitalism, or capitalism causes all these problems. That they're conflating what's happening at the economic layer with what's really going on at their beef is really probably with what's going on underneath.
Yes.
Yeah.
Huge. But if you can't, and you'd have talked about this, unless you have an adequate educational background, you really, it's hard to even start having those really strong opinions, because you're missing the big picture of it all.
And you're hacking at the leaves and the limbs instead of the roots of the problem.
Exactly.
Yeah. So on top of so you got the moral, the political, then the economic. On top of that, you have the social, cultural. How do families operate? How do we take care of the elderly and the poor? How do we take care of invalids and the sick? What does education look like? But they're all informed by that stack. And one of my concerns is that we have, in my opinion, I believe what's happening in the United States, for example. I know you have international listeners, and they can compare how this is happening in theirs. And I'd be interested in your opinion, what you've seen. What are the stacks you've seen in other countries as you've gone around the world and have conversations? We have been shifting our moral layer. We have been swapping it out from what it was. And it's actually not the first swap. We swapped it out about 100 years in, and then we're swapping it out again. We're changing it. And so they're almost like tectonic plates, where when they shift, they cause earthquakes. And so that's what we're seeing in our society is, as the moral layer shifts, the political layer on top has to shift as well. But it's not a smooth, easy process. It's quite, there's a lot of conflict and a lot of back and forth and a lot of anger often as different voices battle and compete for what should the moral layer be. And so as we have shifted our moral layer, I would say roughly this is now the second time we have shifted it since the beginning of our country. And you could argue that there's smaller ones in there, but largely this is the second, I would say. That political layer has to shift. And sometimes it's even let out by the social layer will have already shifted. Like the social layer is shifting. There's a symbiotic relationship between all of these. It's not like one drives the other always. The social, really the people who are living right now, they're going to shift. They're going to be the ones. It's like a circle where the ones who are living right now, they can shift the moral layer. They can determine what the moral layer will be for generations to come. So we started out with a classic liberal, and many listeners may not be familiar with liberalism. It's shifted. That word has shifted in the last 200 years. But classic liberalism, free speech, individual rights, all of those things is what the United States was founded upon. That shifted about 100 years ago to progressivism or progressive liberalism, which has some additional tenets that we could get into it. And now we're looking at a radical individualism or race Marxism, or there's a number of different ways to put it, or identity Marxism, I believe is what we're shifting to now. That's the moral layer that we're shifting to. And you're starting to see.
Let's
go ahead.
Pause there and give us a quick definition of those three things, because this came up in our conversation a few months ago. And I want listeners to just get a little bit of a grasp on those three things and the shift and kind of what the implications are.
Yeah, you bet.
But I think those what do we call those, micro layers or levels? I don't know, but those layers are super significant in how that change is happening.
Yeah, I would call each one of them they're almost religions, really. They are philosophies. They're philosophies. And
people worship them, and they become like fanatics. And you're right, they get this religious zeal around these ideologies. Yeah. And that's why things get so hot and so fired up, and it's so hard to even engage in debate sometimes.
Yes, and that's actually the key to classical liberalism, was to try to solve that problem. Because one thing that I think a lot of people don't realize, is that everyone has a religion. You don't have to have a God, but you are going to have a religion. We are, as human beings, we have to have a religious software running our system. It's our way of looking at the world, of what is right and what is wrong, how I should spend my time, how you should be spending your time, whether I can take your stuff or not and redistribute it. All of those are driven by your moral software. And I'm not talking about any particular religion. It's like that. That is how we run. We determine as human beings what is right and what is wrong. We might get it from somewhere else. We might make our own version of it, but we all have a religion. Everyone has a religion. And all legislation is the legislation of morality. People say you can't legislate morality. It's like, no, actually, law, that's all it is. Law is the legislation. It is codifying moral standards. That's what it is. Don't cheat. Don't, break your contracts. Don't kill people. Those are moral statements codified into law. So like religious, traditionally religious people, deistic religious people, are often criticized for trying to incorporate their religion into the political spheres. Like, that's actually what everyone does. Everyone is trying to have law recreated in their own image, the image of their religion, whatever that religion happens to be. Yeah. So classic liberalism was possibly the first. I mean, the Moors did a really good job of this. I think they did a good job of pluralism as well, hundreds of years ago. But the idea of classic liberalism is, this idea of trying to establish a utopia, trying to take a utopian ideal that religions often give us, whether it's deistic or not. Marx and Hegel, they had a utopian ideal. Even today, the identity Marxists have a utopian ideal, that we're not going to achieve that here on Earth. We have to have a way to talk to each other. We have to have a way that people of differing religions, whether they're deistic or not, can talk to each other and work together. And classic liberalism is that system. It's not aiming at an ideal other than, let's not kill each other. And we have to learn to work together, to live together. That's basically the idea of classic liberalism. Now, in my readings, it actually springs out of Christianity, is where that tolerance, like you go read a letter concerning toleration by Locke, for example. He espouses that idea. It's like, yes, I believe in Christianity, but you cannot force it on people. You have to work with them. You have to listen to them. And this is where we get all these ideas of free speech, of freedom of assembly, the right to debate, the necessity of debate, is all bound up in this idea of classic liberalism. And library, libro, that word comes, it's liberal arts, it's the arts of freedom. So how do we maintain freedom from those who would impose their religious standard upon us? How do we live and work together without fear of that oppression happening to us? So liberals,
because I know how much you and I love books, the fact that libro, which is book in Spanish, and liberty, library, is so tied to freedom. And I know books have totally transformed your life, and they have completely transformed mine, and literally brought freedom in so many ways. So I just a little etymology there, just that connection. Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah. Sorry, keep going with
for sure. Yeah, and I'd love to dive into these once we give those definitions. But basically, the idea behind classical liberalism is We're not going to achieve the utopia. Christianity says the utopia is in the next life. Don't try to achieve it here necessarily. How do we work together? So you've got individual rights. We could talk about where those come from. Human rights, freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, self-defense, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly. All of those kinds of ideas are bound up in classic liberalism. And that the only point of government, and this is where Locke again comes in, he wrote his second treatise on government. You got to go read the first treatise though, but the second treatise on government, they talk about the only purpose of government can be, the only legitimate purpose, and we can dive into this one too, because it's so essential, is to protect life, liberty, and property. That's the only thing that it can do. And that's because that's the only thing that you can delegate. You can only delegate that. That's a right that you have. You have a right, God-given in his estimation, to defend yourself, to defend your loved ones from those who would take your life or that which you've used your life to create, your property. And that's the only thing you can delegate. You can't delegate anything else. You can't. And so that's all that government is for. And that's basically how America started, was with that idea. That's all the government's for. We, the people, do everything else through voluntary cooperation, through consensus. Alexis de Tocqueville, if you read Democracy in America, fantastic book. One of the things that he remarks on when he came over here, he's like, man, these guys get together for everything. If there's a problem, they're like a swarm of bees or ants. They're like, they go solve the problem. They form an association or a society of some sort, and they're always just doing that freely, combining together consensually of their own free will to solve society's problems. Now, but we could get into that farther too. It's like, that's how you solve problems. So we, the people, form a government to protect life, liberty, property, and then we, the people, get together to do everything else in voluntary association. That's basically the idea of classic liberalism. Constitutional conservatism is that basic idea. 100 years later, you had people like Roosevelt, Wilson, and others who said, you know what, there are so many problems in society. There's poverty, there's illiteracy, there's inequality, there's illness, there's homelessness. We've got to solve these problems. And look at this powerful machine that's just sitting there not being used, called government. Why don't we use that? Let's harness that thing and tax, but then go and solve all of society's problems. And so that was progressivism. And that's where you see in the last 100 years of America, this enormous burgeoning administrative state that tries to solve society's problems and removes that responsibility largely, or to some degree, from the individual, from associating with one another, and says, we're going to take care of that. We're going to organize. Came from Prussia. They looked at what they loved, how organized they were over there in a governmental sense. They said, let's borrow that and let's organize it at that level and solve society's problems. That was the second 100 years of America.
Perfect example, and we can dive into this later. That's a perfect example of, on the outset, man, that looks so good. It sounds so good, and like, look what it can do, or look what it's doing. But I think you even mentioned it just in passing, that ultimately that takes away the responsibility and power of the individuals and gathering together on a voluntary basis. And that ultimately will be a disaster.
Yeah, it violates, and it's only until you read Aristotle and the Federalist Papers that you can see the chinks in the armor of progressivism. How could that possibly go wrong? How could that possibly be bad? Because we all want to feed the hungry and clothe the naked and heal the sick and educate the ignorant and free the captives. We want to do those things. How could that possibly be wrong? And it's like, if you want to pull up Google Maps to get you somewhere, several hours away, there's one right way to get there. There's one best way to get there, and there's thousands of ways to go wrong. You can make a wrong turn on that road in innumerable ways. And that's the path of the path. If human happiness and flourishing is that destination, it has that same problem. It has that same conundrum where that road looks better, but it doesn't actually take you where you think it's going to take you. And so that's why you have to read. have to read, because it's here's my favorite analogy for it. In the Marvel movies, you had Doctor Strange towards the end of that whole series of movies, for those who watched them. And Doctor Strange got this thing called a time stone. And they had this villain called Thanos who killed half of the life in the universe. And they're like, how do we defeat him and bring back those people? So he had the time stone. He had several of the stones as well. And what he did is he went through and he iterated using this time stone. He would go back and start again, like millions of times, like in his mind, or he would just go back and try to find what is the path to defeat this enemy. And he realized there was only one way to do it. And like he couldn't even tell the other superheroes what that way was until the moment that they could use it. That's kind of how the path to human flourishing is there's so many ways to get it wrong. But they've been tried. Again and again. Again and again and again. Yes. And so we can go back and we can go to Dr. Strange and say, the 1,000th and the 3,000th and the 4 millionth time that you tried it, we're going to try those again. It's like, no, he didn't do that. He tried it. It didn't work. He moved on to the next one. He moved on to the next one. And because we don't read these books, which document the often sad tales of what happened when it didn't go right. You could make a movie about each one of the million things that he tried, right? All the different variations that didn't work and how they ended sadly. They only made a movie about the one that worked. Exactly. But there were a million other movies that could have been made. And they have been made in terms of the story of human flourishing and happiness, because you can go and see the wreckage in the history books
and societies, and it's all there. And that's one thing that kind of boggles my mind is we'll have people in our generation that they think they're the first ones to think of it, to come up with this new idea, like, no, hey, let's try this, it'll work. I'm like, my response is, haven't you read? Like, that was tried before and it did not work at all.
Yeah.
But you're right, you have to, and it's hard. Understandably, it's challenging. That's a lot of books to read, and that's a lot of history to cover to see all the ways it didn't work.
Yeah, and I'm not even saying that the founders nailed it, but one of my favorite things about Aristotle, not his first book, but there's kind of a 1-2 punch from Aristotle. One is Ethics, which is basically the story. We can dive into ethics. That'd be really fun. But it's basically the question of how do we achieve human happiness, which he describes as the greatest good. That is the thing that we should all, that we are all. It's not that we should be seeking. It's what we all do seek, is happiness. And his second book, or the next book, Politics, then tries to describe what kind of government you have to set up to enable that, to best make that. What do we do? And when you start reading Politics, he does exactly what Dr. Strange did. He catalogs all of he goes through the history books and he says, this form didn't work. This form didn't work. Monarchy, that's obsolete. In 350 BC, he said monarchy didn't work. And we still have monarchies today. We didn't listen to Aristotle. He's like, that's obsolete. And here we are still running that software. We're still running the monarchy software, even though he recognized, 2,300 years ago that it doesn't work. We don't want to listen, and that we could talk about why we don't want to listen. Why do we not want to listen to those tales? So he did. He went and tried to learn the lessons from and tried another iteration. There he was, Dr. Strange in his generation, looking at the past iterations and saying, okay, I'm going to tweak it this way. I'm going to tweak it this way. I'm going to tweak it this way. The founding generation, 2,000 years later, had 2,000 years worth of history to look at of other societies and civilizations trying out their Doctor Strange iterations and seeing what didn't work. And they had the benefit of people like Montesquieu, who came along, that Aristotle didn't have the benefit of Montesquieu or Locke or Smith or Aquinas or any of these others. And so they built the next iteration. If we're going to follow, the wisdom of Dr. Strange of not trying something that was tried before and didn't work, you have to know what iterations have been tried. You have to understand, or you're going to tweak it in a way that just takes you back down a path that is already known. Federalist Papers are fantastic for that, because they say, you've got to do it this way. You can't do it that way. Here's the problem with that. If you try to go left at that turn, it's going to take you down this road. And if you try, And gosh, if we would just read those, even at the high school level, because they're, every single one of these models, they're really software trying to run on the hardware of human nature. That's really what they are. And so we've all been trying to figure out human nature for all these thousands of years, and trying different software running on that platform and see which one runs the best and which one crashes and which one does the most damage when it crashes. So we need to, it's almost like, I grew up in the era where the like Word Perfect or Microsoft Word, 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, they would just keep iterating, and you can go back and look and see what version you're on now. They don't make a big deal of it now. They used to make a really big deal. Now version 10, and then they kind of lost their fervor for publishing which version they're on. But it's almost like being on 10 and going back to 6. Who wants to do that? You lose all this functionality, you're going back in time. So that's my question for anyone who wants to make changes to society is like, what have you done to do the doctor? Have you done the Doctor Strange thing where you've looked at what's been tried, so you try that again?
What's interesting is this comes up often in our conversations with other people, or even online. Is we'll share something, and this happened last week. My wife shared this idea of like, hey, we should be reading the classics. And she got a response one day, is like, what could we possibly learn from old books? That was the legitimate response. And I could see the reasoning of like, wait, if we have version 10, why would we go back to version 6? And you can see like, well, what do old books have to teach us? Like, we're the most advanced. But I think the lesson here is your advancedness might just be a repetition of something that's already proven not to work. And so, circling back is one of the benefits of circling back, is seeing what didn't work.
I was listening to Brett Weinstein, Dr. Weinstein, on a podcast he did yesterday. He's an evolutionary biologist who had a fascinating story of being kicked out basically by the students of Evergreen State College, I think in Washington State, where they went super woke. And he being he calls himself a radical progressive, but he wasn't radical enough for them. Fascinating story. Well, let's see, what was I going to say? What he said? Oh, that the reason why the versions issue doesn't work with humans is what we've learned is that our hardware wants to go awry. Our hardware, our nature wants to go awry. There's part of us that wants happiness in the right way, and there's part of us that wants happiness in the wrong way. And so these different iterations, these different Doctor Strange iterations of 1.0, 2.0, 3.0 is realizing, oh, you have some inclinations, human being. You, Homo sapien, have some inclinations within you that are actually anti-happiness, anti-social, that you're born with, but that you have to guard against. So for example, we have an inclination to find the easiest path to wherever we want to go. I saw this when I was at university, and they had a big quad, and you had buildings around this big lawn. And did people take they took the most direct path. They took the diagonal. They wore out the lawn, and then the administration got all frustrated. Like, why do I take the diagonal path to get to kitty corners? Like, well, I don't want to take the long way where I have to then make a left turn. It's like, I want to take the shortest path. That is actually good because it drives us to, as a good side, because it drives us to find easier, faster, more efficient ways to do things. But there's a downside to it where we will, like, if I can go just take something, if I can take the lollipop from my sister, or I can take the cash from my neighbor, or if I can, if I can get it in unscrupulous ways, quote unquote, unscrupulous, whatever that means, that's going to the moral layer, right? Who decides what's unscrupulous? Then, might makes right. That's certainly a way. That's certainly a moral layer. You could certainly build a political layer on top of that theology, that I am the king, therefore what I say goes, and you all pay homage to me, and my happiness is what actually matters. And look, we're achieving it at the expense of all of you. There is those totalitarian, authoritarian, dictatorial, it's like what Viktor Frankl said, who said, in Man's Search for Meaning, he was the one in the concentration camps. He said, the line dividing good and evil runs through every human heart. Yeah, that's the human nature problem. And so that's why you have to study the prior versions. You don't have to study the prior versions of Google Chrome and Microsoft Word. It's like, no, you don't need to do that. But you do of human nature, because every child that is born has that same the hardware hasn't changed. We're just trying to find the best software to guard, mold, sculpt us as human beings to maximize our happiness. So that's why the versioning part, that's why you have to read all the books.
Yep. I love this. Okay, there's so much I want to dive into, but I want to finish the definition. So define for us that individualism you think we've moved into. And then I want to dive in, to ethics, Aristotle, all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, this one's a little more difficult because in this religion, there's lots of denominations, which you could say is true of really any religion. Christianity, for example, has 45,000 denominations in the world. Some of them are actually murderous. Some of them are suicidal. Some of them go and, do terrible things and protest things they shouldn't protest. You have to be careful. There is no such thing as there is no monolithic in these religions. And the same is true of this identitarianism, this radical identitarianism. And it might be most easily, basically the idea, well, again, there's so many different denominations that they play almost chameleon with you. Or again, if we could use the Marvel analogies, Loki, he can like disappear and appear. He can, and so anytime you go to grasp at one, they'll say that's not it. It's this one over here. Because they all have slightly different, but they spring from. You've got Kant, Hegel, Marx, Gramsci, Bell. Just down, there's all these different philosophers who built on one another to build different versions, but they all trace back to this Hegelian concept that the utopia is possible, that that is possible here on Earth if we can, that it actually exists. There's actually this beautiful thing, this beautiful society that exists, but it's like held in chains. If we can just peel back the chains, the onion, then the perfect society will reveal itself. And so there's this idea of the dialectic, that if you look at what's wrong with society and say, how do we get rid of what's wrong with society? That's how you peel the onion, is this thing called the dialectic. And so all these different versions, they're actually at each odds with each other, in that they're saying that's what's wrong with that version. Gramsci did this with Marx. He said Marx focused on the wrong thing. He should have been focused on this. He didn't pay enough attention to cultural factors. He didn't pay enough attention to how family, how religion, how legal structures. Because Marx thought that, and I'm going too deep before I give the definition, but basically what we're living with right now is this radical identitarianism, which is what you say, what you feel within you, that's the only voice you have to listen to, and everyone has to honor it. If I were to put it in a nutshell, your identity is what's most important, and everyone has to honor that and change their language around you, perhaps. And every religion is really about an identity transplant. I mean, Christianity is all about taking on someone else's name and living your life as if you were them. That is, that person in Christianity is Jesus Christ. You're supposed to live your life as though you were him. You're supposed to do what he would do. What would Jesus do? The bumper sticker. It is an identity transplant. In my particular denomination of Christianity, when you get baptized, you take upon yourself the name of Christ. You pray in the name of Christ. It is about identity. It's about identity. So I don't want to disparage the concept of identity. The question is, what identity are you trying to take upon yourself? And if it's your own, the one what is calling out of you, well, it doesn't make for a very cohesive society, because there's not a uniform. If you have to honor them all, I mean, that's the question: can you honor them all?
With so many differences and so much uniqueness, because initially, and I'm all about sovereignty and autonomy and the strength of an individual and a family, but ultimately that won't work in a society.
Well, the interesting thing about sovereignty is that individual sovereignty is not, universal isn't the right word. It is not, it's not limitless. The concept of individual sovereignty is not without bounds, without boundaries. Where does and this is where you have to go down the stack. It's like, well, where did this idea of in fact, sovereignty, individual sovereignty, is what gives rise to human rights. So you got to pass through human rights and get to this idea of human sovereignty. Where does it come from? Well, as far as I can tell, it comes, Locke, for example, Aquinas, they talked about it. It's because you are made in the image of the divine creator. You have autonomy over yourself as you seek to do his will. It's not as you do whatever you want. We have to do what he wants. Each of us has to do it. So you're autonomous and have sovereignty towards a specific aim, not towards whatever aim you want.
Some kind of noble aim or moral high ground.
It's very constricted. It's very constrained. It's much like jet fuel or rocket fuel. If you just light rocket fuel, it will make an enormous explosion. It won't take you anywhere, and it'll probably do a great deal of damage. But if you constrain it within a specific structure called a rocket, it will take you places. Yeah. And individual sovereignty, individual will is very much like that.
Within bounds.
It's within certain bounds. And what are the bounds? That's the software. That's the moral layer. And we've been trying to figure that out for generation upon generation.
This is so fun hearing you articulate this, because Rachel and I have been deeply discussing this. For those of you listening who don't know, Rachel's my wife, and we're taking our family to Norway in December. So we've been studying Norwegian history, and she's been simultaneously reading this book called The Book That Made Your World. And it's from an Indian guy referencing the Bible and how the Bible brought in the worth of the individual and how a lot of the frameworks of the law. So that was the moral code that brought in this framework, where we see over in a lot of the Norwegian history, it was just the raiding. Every summer they went on raids and they just killed whoever, wherever, to take their stuff. Like, no qualms, no problems, like fighting. And everything was fated. It was just complete fate. It was just like, if you die, it's fate. If this happens, it's totally fate. If I beat you, it's fate. If I lose, it's fate. There was no, it was just a different moral code, right? So it's fascinating to dig through all this stuff. But I think this is a good transition here. Let's dive into ethics and happiness, and what Aristotle was saying on that. And so then if the ultimate goal, like he's saying, is happiness, how does that fit into the individual, the family, the society? Let's dive into that.
Yeah, absolutely. So he starts out, and this is a difficult read. Ethics is a difficult read. It's like rich chocolate. You have to take little bites because it's just so dense, and it makes you really think. And that's what a classic is. The man was a genius, and ethics is just one of several books that he wrote. I mean, I think I've got right here for those who are, happen to be seeing, there's like 2 books this thick of tiny print, tiny margins. Like, this guy was writing with, I don't even know what kind of utensil 2,300 years ago. I don't know. We're so lucky to have him and have his writings. But he started out asking the question. He says, you know what? If you think about it, everything we do aims at some good. Everything. And often we do that it aims at, there's a good on top of that one. So you do this, like you buy a tool, not just to have the tool, but so you can build something with that tool. So the tool itself is a good, but it's not the ultimate good. The good on top of that good was whatever you're building. But you didn't just build that building. That's not the ultimate good either. You built that building, maybe it's a house, so you can, your family can reside in it, and you can have time with your family inside that house. But even that's not necessarily the highest. He's like, is there like an infinite regress? Does this just go on forever? Or is there like an ultimate thing that we're all aiming towards? And he says, there is, I think it is, and I think there is, and it's called happiness. That's what we're all aiming for. That is the end of man. That is what that is the ultimate achievement, is happiness. And so he writes this huge book on happiness. Like, what is this thing, and what are the impediments to it, and what has worked and what hasn't, and let's figure this thing out. So one of the first things that he talks about, he says, character is necessary for happiness. Happiness is a pursuit of virtue, not pleasure. It's a pursuit of virtue. That's, he talks about the people that try to pursue just pleasure. It's like, no, they don't end up happy. The ones who end up happy are the ones who pursue virtue. And it's like, well, what's virtue? He said, virtue, it's this really hard thing. It's this right way to act in the right amount toward the right people at the right time for the right length all the time forever. It's like, and it's like really, really hard, but that's what virtue is. And it's almost like this needle. If this needle was pointing up, if you're like on a dashboard and you had this needle pointing straight up as like your true north, that you're acting in the right way, it's so easy to act in the wrong way a little bit to the left or to the right, meaning you did too much of it or you did too little of it. And as parents, we can see this in parenting. It's like there's a right way to handle a given situation with a child, but there's also a whole shades of gray on both sides of doing too little or too much. You can be overbearing or you can be coddling. And so he goes through and he names like a dozen at least virtues. And he says there's an excess and a deficiency of each, and he explores them. He says, like courage, for example. Courage, this is what courage is, and he explains courage. And he says, but you can have too much courage. You can be rash. You could charge the enemy when there really is no way to defeat the enemy through that charge and just end up killing yourself and your men, for example. That would be rashness. It's possible to have an excess of courage. But it's also possible to have a deficiency of courage where you're cowardly and you don't exhibit enough courage. And he goes through, like I said, a dozen or more of this, and he explores and he agonizes over them, and he gives examples of history where people did it right and where people did it wrong. And he says, you've got to pursue virtue. And this is a lifelong pursuit. It's a lifelong pursuit of building character. Character is making habit out of virtue, so that it becomes more and more automatic. Because until it's automatic, you have to work at it. And it's difficult in the extreme. That's one of my favorite phrases from Aristotle. It's difficult in the extreme. It's something you got to be working at your entire life. Character through the exercise of virtue is what he talks about. It requires action. Choice is essential. You have to have the ability to choose. So there's a freedom element. You've got to act. It's not good enough to just think about it, but he does talk about thinking quite a bit. How contemplation is one of the highest activities, because you've got to contemplate how should you act, how should you be. So you've got virtue. So he's building this recipe, right? This stack of what do you got to do to get to happiness. He's got character in there through virtue. Over a lifelong pursuit. You've got actions that you're taking to build that virtue. You're making choices. Your motive and your intent totally matter. You can't do things for the wrong reason. So do the right thing in the right amount for the right reasons with the right person for the right amount. It's like, oh my gosh, are you serious? Like, yes. And that's why we live for more than just 2 weeks. Like some bugs and animals, we have lived for decades. So we can figure this out. You have to deliberate. You have to agonize. And he says, how do we figure this out? He says, and this is one of my things I love the most about Aristotle. He says, there's this thing in every human being. I run across it in every person that I talk to. I call it reason. There's like this voice inside of us. And I think it's divine, he says, or it's at least the most divine thing in us. But this voice says the same thing to pretty much every human being and tells them what the right action is, or at least tells them what the wrong action is. And if you listen and cultivate that voice, that's what tells you what the virtuous action is. That's how you know. It's within us, but it's got to be external to us because it exists in all of us. So I don't know what you call it. He calls it reason. Some people might call it conscience, but there's this voice. And so you have to cultivate that voice. He says the voice can be silenced. You can act against the voice and you will silence the voice. So so there's a positive spiral and a negative spiral where if you listen to that voice and act consistently with it and work on virtue and character, the voice will continue to guide you. But if you go in the opposite direction, the voice will be overpowered and you won't be able to hear it anymore. And that's a terrible thing to contemplate, because then man becomes a beast. And he's got some great quotes about how men can be beasts. Men can be beasts or they can be angels. And again, that's Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl, 2000 later, is channeling Aristotle. You got the beast and the angel within us. Okay, so you got happiness. He's like building this stairway to happiness. You've got character developed through virtue, which is, you have to act. In order to act, you have to have choice. Your choices have to be properly motivated. You have to deliberate and you have to listen to reason. And if you do that, you will achieve, you'll achieve happiness. But that's not even that's not all. He says there's actually there's this concept of a complete life, which happiness is a component of. Happiness is what we're looking for, but the complete life is, because you can have someone who's doing all that, but they still live in poverty. And so he said there's actually 4 components. You've got to have happiness. You have to have wisdom. Now let's see. Wisdom is knowledge of things that don't change. He's saying there's things that don't change, and you've got to know them. And he says you've also got to have judgment, which is knowledge of things which do change. So you've got to be able to judge between things that do change and bob and weave, and you've got to have both those. And then he says you have to have, and this is the biggest surprise to me, was property. You can't subsist without property, and you can't be generous and magnanimous, which are 2 of the virtues, which means you're giving. You are giving. You know, if you're not super wealthy, you're just generous. It means you're giving within your what you can, within your circle of influence. But if you're wealthy, you have to be magnanimous. You have to give greatly, and that's a virtue. And so property is essential to happiness, as is wisdom, as is judgment, as is virtue, acquired through action, choice, deliberation, and listening to reason, or that voice that lives within all of us. And he says, as you do this, by the way, the greatest of all virtues is justice, because you're making sure that right action is done to everyone around you, not just yourself. That you're ensuring that happens at a societal level. Justice, the right action to the right people in the right amount, the right time, for the right reasons. That's justice. That's what justice is in his, which is a different definition, by the way, hopping back to a prior conversation. In radical individualism or identity Marxism, justice or social justice has a very different definition. So you have to know what definitions you're talking about. Words matter. So, okay, going back to Aristotle, he said justice. That's what you're all aiming for on a societal level. Happiness is what you're aiming for at an individual level. Here's the recipe to get there. And by the way, pleasure is great. Just make sure it works within this framework. And by the way, one of the greatest pleasures you're going to have, within the boundaries. Let me build the rocket ship for you. The fuel is your own willpower, your energy, your ambition. Channel it properly, and it'll take you to the right place. It'll take you to the stars. Another interesting observation he made is that one of the greatest sources of pleasure you can have in life is friendship. Friendships of virtue, not friendships of utility and pleasure, although those aren't necessarily bad, but the highest form of friendship are friendships of virtue. People who that you actually get pleasure and delight and fulfillment from these relationships with other people who are on that same path, operating within the same constraints. And then he says, and by the way, that's how you build cities. People who are operating magnanimously, generously, working towards virtue, and they have these friendships and are seeking to instill justice within the communities. They're the one. They are the fabric that creates virtuous cities.
Those are the friends you want. That's the community you want. That's the kind of people you want to build a society with. And I would say that's the only kind of people that will actually sustain a society that'll last, because you let any of that erode and things start to just unravel. And as you've been describing what he's talking about here with wisdom and happiness and justice and property, and I'm sure the listeners have heard this too, you're picking up bits and pieces all over of these voices that are contrary to all of this right now. And they're out there, and there's a lot of them moving away from property. I keep hearing that. There's places around the world that we're just like, hey, look, you don't need to own anything. We'll own it all for you. You don't have to have the burden of ownership. And they're moving away from property ownership. And then there's away from wisdom or the judgment, and then just individualism and relativism. So there's a lot of voices right now, a lot of messages coming in contradiction to a lot of this.
You know, I was listening to, I don't know if you're familiar with Ben Shapiro. He's a conservative commentator, really big in the United States. But he did a piece, I think it was yesterday or today, where he he read online an article written by a young lady. Well, she's now 43, not so young anymore. I wish I could remember her name. Bridget, I think is her name. But she said, like, I regret being a slut was the name of this article. She had been very promiscuous. She was raised in a very conservative Catholic background, rejected that, believed that it repressed her sexuality, and then went and just gave herself to whoever, whenever. And it's a moving, beautiful piece, how she's now come full circle and said, I don't think my Catholic upbringing did it right, but boy, did my own search for happiness through sexual promiscuity, it did not bring happiness. It brought misery. And she walks through all these different ways that it made her miserable and how she feels about it. And now she's on her second marriage, she has a child, and she's on a different path towards happiness. And the question, and I highly recommend it to your readers to go search that out. But the question is, are we going to learn those lessons? Because she's like, I'm going to teach my kid. I'm going to teach my kid what I didn't get taught. I'm going to try to improve. I'm going to try to iterate. She didn't say this Dr. Strange-wise, but when it comes to my child's sexuality, I'm going to try to iterate and do better. I rejected, what was given to me, but maybe they didn't get it perfectly right. But the way I went and tried to do it was far worse. Yeah. So the question is, are we going to learn this stuff from books? Or are we going to learn it ourselves in our own lives, and in our 40s and 50s and 60s say, oops, you youngins, listen, you young whippersnappers, listen to me, because I know better. He's like, that's why education is so critical, because we're all born and think we're like, this beautiful wide world, and I've got all these voices speaking inside of me, of which one of them is reason. That's not the only reason. That's not the only voice. And sometimes there's louder voices within me, right? Especially during puberty. And so it's like, what voices are we going to listen to? And if we don't study what the voice, those lessons of the past, we get to learn them through the experience of the life of. We get to get the degree of the University of Hard Knocks, which is life itself,
which is so miserable.
Which can be so miserable.
Can be, yes. It's so challenging, so difficult. And I get to work with individuals and families literally every single day. And I've had the privilege of working with thousands and thousands and thousands of people across 5 continents and dozens of countries. It's a privilege of mine that people reach out to me and I get to help them, but many of them are in those depths of misery. And I get to see the pain and the suffering from choices. And they tell me those experiences, right? And as a young man, my parents made decisions and stepdads came and went. I ended up out on my own. I had some years of hard, lonely misery. And I was living in these broken places, these rundown, horrible communities, and seeing the suffering and the pain that's just perpetual there. And being right there on it and in it and surrounded by it. And I just feel like shouting from the rooftops at everyone, like, hey, don't make those choices. That just hurts. That stuff is so painful. And then to hear you talk about, I've got this, I've got ethics right here on my desk. I'm working through it. And I just got a beautiful leather-bound copy of Politics and Poetics from him as well. But hearing you explain that, I think this is a book. There's so many great books in the world, but this is a book we all ought to be contemplating and consuming a little bit, maybe even on a daily or weekly basis, just chewing on those few things you outlined so well. Like, that's the essence of life and striving to live a good life. And I'm reminded of the quote by it's in Moby Dick. Melville says that we're surrounded often like a little island in the Pacific, surrounded by all the horrors of a half-lived life, instead of living a whole life or a full life or a complete life. Right? Like Frankl talks about, when you lack meaning, your life is just empty.
Yeah. I'm reminded of Anna Karenina, Tolstoy. His opening line in that great book is, happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. There is innumerable ways to get it wrong, but that constraint, There's like one way to get it right. Now, it doesn't mean it looks like every family looks the same, because acting the right way towards the right people in the right amount for the right amount of time for the right reasons has wonderful variety and diversity on an individual and familial and societal, foods and music and traditions are so rich and wonderful. It's not about uniformity. It's not about conformity to like everyone has to be like Gary or like Greg, but there is a voice that does tell you how you have to be like, and it's going to be, whatever virtue looks like. So every happy family is alike, and every unhappy family is unlike. There's so many ways to get it wrong. So are we going to try to figure it out from scratch, or are we going to go to Dr. Strange and say, can I read all the million ways that it got it wrong? And you said you got politics. I disagree with a lot of what Aristotle said in politics. He was doing the best that he could. He was saying, here's all the different ways it's been tried. I think this is what we've got to do. But I see the seeds of totalitarianism and authoritarianism in his politics, because he's like, we've got to parent this way, and we've got to. It's like, so it's like, okay, you're going to mandate that. So you've got the power to mandate. Can that ever go wrong? And that, yes, it can, and it did, and it has, and that's where the founders said, power, it's the one ring, man. It's the one ring from Tolkien. With this ring, I would hope to do great good, but through me, it would work great evil. That's power is the one ring. You can't concentrate it. And Aristotle was toying with concentrating power to try to do good. And what the founders, after 2,000 years of trying, said, no, you can't concentrate power. You have to distribute it at the closest level possible to the people who need it. This tiny bit at the top, you've got to separate it horizontally, vertically, auxiliary precautions, checks and balances, like this crazy, matrix, lattice work of divide power. Because power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Human nature. They recognize the hardware. Power doesn't do good on running on our system. It does terrible. Every human beings, who is immune from the effects of power. So, as far as reading, politics, read it and then compare it to the founding and what lessons they learned.
That's exactly. You stacking on. That's why you have to read so many books and read, read politics, knowing that it influenced other thinkers, and then read the other thinkers, and then read the outcomes all through that.
Yeah.
Oh, it's so beautiful. I had a kind of a curiosity that I know comes up. How do we keep from consuming just one side or the other, or getting in an echo chamber? Sometimes we'll get sucked into listening to one side. In the United States, we talk about the right and the left, or the conservatives or liberals. Like, how do you approach that? What do you feel like is, in your perspective, is a good way to not just get stuck in one echo chamber or the other, or to just grab hold of one concept or group? Because we like to do that. We like to fit in. We like to belong. And if they, the majority are here, but then we start, oh, well, they're the enemy, and it doesn't matter what they say, even if it's reasonable and logical and actually good. They're in the other camp. How do we stay whole?
We have to purposely, intentionally enter what's called the Great Conversation.
Yes.
The Great Conversation is a book here on my shelf. It's part of the Great Book series right here, back here, And the idea is that this question of human flourishing and happiness has been going on for thousands of years. And I'm open to Aristotle being wrong. I'm open to the founders being wrong. But let's have that conversation. Let's have that debate. And so what these, like, if you look at the Great Books series, which is, I've heard that, some people are listening, just go look up Great Books, Britannica Great Book series. There's like 52 volumes or something like that. And it's basically it's the consolidation of the greatest minds and thinkers trying to wrestle over these and other questions of human existence. And so we have to be.
That's similar. It's similar to the Harvard Classics and sets like that, isn't it?
Yes, I've got both of those. The Harvard Classics is another set. So yeah, you've got the Britannica Great Books. There is some crossover, but not as much as you would think. The Harvard Classics, as I recall, are more about literature. than they are about philosophy. More like which of course literature often is a source of philosophy, but the Great Books series is more of philosophical, treatise on right, wrong, economics, moral, political. Whereas Harvard gets you more into essays and fiction, and some of which is explores these very questions, like for example, Pilgrim's Progress, explores Christianity and the software that runs, Christianity as software that runs on the human nature hardware platform. You've got Pilgrim's Progress. Yeah. So yeah, there's, I'm like this far in a huge, list of books, but Great Books is a place where that conversation takes place. And so that's the answer. That's the answer for me to your question.
Conversation, because I know there's a lot of people. When I heard about this years and years ago, I'm like, what are they talking about? But getting in the great debate or the great conversation is jumping into really via books. This conversation has been going on for a very long time of like, how do we do life?
Yeah.
What's the best way to do life? And so the way to keep yourself from being sucked away into little rabbit holes or whatever, or missing things, is go ahead and read it all across genres and really think through it all. Get into these deep classics. I have to ask you a question because I'm interested in your opinion. Again, this week, somebody we suggested a list like the Great Books or a set, and they're just like, ugh. And it was a very woke comment of like, oh, that's just more stuff from white men, right? And I was like, like, okay, yes, a lot of those books were written by white men. You're right, but like these are some of the greatest thinkers of all time. Like, so I'm interested in your perspective on and a response to that. Like, because this individual, and again, it came from a pretty good place. They're like, but we need to read outside of that because it's just more white men telling us what they think.
Yeah, that's a whole nother conversation, isn't it? Isn't it amazing that we can categorize an entire, it's interesting that this religion of radical individualism groups people, wide swaths of people, and labels them like white people. Okay, so you're telling me someone who from ancient Greece 2,300 years ago, Greece, not Europe, but Greece, 2,300 years ago, who lived a life completely different than any white person in the last 1,000 years, you're going to put him in the same category as Jefferson or Gary or Greg. He's still a white male. It's like as though we're so homogenous. Yep. It's like no. It's life is far more complex and sophisticated and beautiful than. I mean, how many colors are in your palette? 16? No, there's millions of colors in the palette, millions of ideas. So this is about ideas, not people. That's actually racist to reject something, and sexist to reject something based on someone's skin color. It's actually, in fact, that's the racism. Words are now changing underneath our feet. Racism is a word that has changed. In Racism 2.0, what's called anti-racism is you cannot be racist towards white people. You cannot be sexist towards heterosexual male white people. They are the enemy. They are who has, they're responsible for all misery of mankind. And so that's a whole nother interesting religious, that's an article of faith, by the way. It's an article of faith of that religion, that you can reject someone based on their skin color, their sexuality, their ancestry. That's an article of faith. I reject that article of faith. I've investigated that religion. I chose not to get baptized in it. I've chosen to stay with others that I have investigated as well. But it is a religion. It's a mode of being, a mode of belief. And the point of reading these books is the idea is these are arguably, you don't have to read everything that's ever been written. These are just considered the best. These are the most clearly articulated. It's like, okay, go read them and see if you can find what's wrong. I mean, there's books in there that I disagree with. There's Marx. Yeah. He's part of the great debate. He and others, Freud is in there as well. They're part of the great conversation is not saying this is the only way. It's simply saying, here's the greatest articulations of different viewpoints
Those
so
ideologies.
far.
Yeah,
And
they're classics and should be read, even though we may not agree with them, or they might be like, hey, this isn't something we want to incorporate. Still a great classic, and we have to understand what's going on.
yeah, they don't agree with each other.
Right.
They don't agree with each other. That, I mean, anyone who says I'm going to reject them because they're a tradition that I reject, it's like, no, understand they're often vehemently opposed to one another, but they're the ideas that have had the greatest impact on the world, that people have believed with greatest ferocity, have built their whole lives, built their whole civilizations, multi-generational. So they had great impact on people. They were very believable to those people. They're being believed now by different groups of people. You can start from scratch if you want to. You can go to Doctor Strange and say, I'm going to start at level 1. But that's not a very intelligent way.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not a very intelligent way to go about it.
Wow.
I'm going to reinvent math. I'm going to reinvent language. I'm going to reinvent geometry. I'm going to reinvent bridge building and agriculture and architecture. It's like, really? That's the way you want to go about life, is start over with caveman? It's like, no. In fact, it's a sign of extreme privilege to even be able to have those questions, have those, to even scoff is a sign of extreme privilege, because as you drive your car on the road, having eaten the food, where all of this was created by this great conversation, which you can disagree with, but let's disagree and let's get granular and let's really wrestle. You can't just dismiss out of hand without dismissing out of hand all the fruits.
Yeah. Amazing. Oh man. And what inevitably comes to mind, because it impacted me so profoundly, is Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago, and how wrong, so far wrong, some of these ideologies and philosophies went to just millions and tens of millions of people just being tortured and killed at the end result of a lot of these ideas, right? It's so out of hand, it just was an absolute disaster.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
that was taking place. My mother's still alive, and that was happening in her lifetime when she was a child.
It was happening in my life. The Cultural Revolution in China, 100 million people killed, families turning on one another, horrible within my lifetime. It's, again, these things are not in the past. They live within each one of us. That line still is drawn through every human heart. So we have to read. There's two ways to learn it. Either we learn from those who have, and I'm not saying they were, the question, it's not a matter of were they right. The question is, are you going to try to learn from them, or are you going to go at it alone? And would you do that with any other, with the ideas of morality, politics, economics, and social structure? Are you going to try to build it from scratch, or are you going to go and learn? It's like an architecture major going to college and saying, I'm not going to go to college. I'm not going to learn best practices. I'm not going to learn industry standards. I'm going to start with these twigs that I pulled off of a tree, and I'm going to figure it out on my own. Do you really want to do that with morality? But we feel freedom. We feel uninhibited. We feel like if I could just cast off the shackles of the rocket, I could explode in whatever direction I want to. And we do.
Build a bridge or a building any way I want. Why do I have to follow these engineering rules?
Principles.
They're so restrictive.
Yes, exactly. They're so restrictive.
Let me ask them though, because the listeners have got to be asking, like, okay, how in the world? We have businesses, we have families, we have projects, hobbies. How do you fit in time to learn, Gary? Let's get down to some logistics here.
Yeah.
What's a day in the life of, a week in the life of? How are you consuming this stuff?
That's a really great question. It's one I've wrestled with because I believe it's essential, and I believe we've almost entirely lost it. The vast majority of people in my culture, in my part of the world, in my country, do not do this. Agreed. And we have left the The guard towers, we have left the gates. We are no longer watching them to make sure that no poor philosophy enters in and corrupts and breaks down our buildings. We're not watching anymore. We're not studying it. The price of liberty is eternal vigilance. We're not vigilant. We are, and we have been trained to be possibly involved in our family. That's also been now in dispute. Very much involved in a career of some sort. That's a big one. Although we do see that cracking even in some places now, where people say college is no longer necessary. Which that's a whole argument. It's a whole discussion we could get into, because there are good arguments against that. But how do you find the time? You have to make the time, and you have to choose. This is my concern with social media, with TikTok reels, with Instagram reels, with Facebook reels. You can get on there and it can just suck you in. It's like Harry Potter with those breathers that those what they call those black ghost like things that would just suck the life out of you. There are things in our society that suck your time. And you look at any one of them individually, and they're humorous, they're interesting, they're even maybe minorly educational. But what you're not considering is, what are you not doing because you're doing that? What are you not reading because you're watching that movie? What do you not, because if you are, I saw I think a show called Better Call Saul or something like that. It was a multi-season series, and the people who watched said, "Oh, the ending was so profound. You had to get through several seasons of not family safe stuff to watch it." But it's like, okay, what it's like, okay, that was a price you paid to get whatever you got out of that show. And I've not watched the show, so I can't speak to it. But what did you not get? What did you not read so you could watch that? And I'm not saying we shouldn't have wholesome recreational activity. We shouldn't have hobbies. Most of our interaction has been through our hobby, this mutual hobby that we have. But there's got to be time set aside, which means stuff you're not going to do other stuff. So you can sit down, and it's very thankless. Nobody wants to discuss them with you. It's like, hey, you want to read Aristotle and discuss it with me?
And when you tell your friends and family what you're doing, they're like, what?
Like, what? Why would you need to?
Hours on that? Like, what's wrong with you?
It's not even part of our vernacular anymore. But when you read it, you start to and the change is relatively slow. Although I'll say in the last 10 years, the rate of change to our stack, the rate of replacement of what's in that stack, it's like Jenga, where you're pushing out one layer and you could put something else in instead. The replacement of our stack is happening at a nearly visible rate in the last 5 years, 10 years. It's been remarkable.
So much faster now.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
and I think across the whole stack, the moral, political, economic, and social, cultural, and you're watching it happen. Like, all stop. Did you just see that? Like, right in front of us, we just watched part of the stack change.
Yes. So that's remarkable, because I would say that before this decade, it's been slow enough that it's the frog, boiling slowly in the pot, but now people are like, what is this? Their hands are getting burned, their feet are getting burned in the pot, but they don't know what to do about it, because they don't have nothing to compare it to other than 30, 40 years ago when they were growing up. It's like, boy, things are different than when I was growing up, but I guess that's true of everyone, right? Okay, I'll stay in the pot and I'll continue to let the water boil, but it's when you read these things that you start to realize, wait a second, I can compare that to Federalist 10. And I believe Federalist 10. I think he's right. And this violates that without providing a better explanation, without refuting Federalist 10. And that to me is the great conversation. I'm open. Bring it on. I have read more about wokeism, CRT, anti-racism, all of that in the last 2 years than probably any other topic, which maybe isn't good for my soul, but I've wanted to understand them. I've wanted to understand Marcuse. I wanted to understand Foucault. I've wanted to understand Derrida. I want to understand Crenshaw. I want to understand Gramsci. I want to understand what's happening to my society. I want to understand the world that my children are growing up in. And they it's like overnight success happens in 40 years, but people just start to notice it. The roots of what's happening in our society didn't start 5 years ago, 10 years ago. They started 100, 200, 300 years ago, but they are manifesting, with technology now. It's so much easier to spread and broadcast and share memes that call into question the entire basis of Western civilization and mock it and make it look wrong. But if you haven't read the books, you can't see the flaw in the meme, in the argument, in the single snarky comment. It's like, the idea that a lie gets halfway around the world before the truth gets its boots on. That's the boots on are these books. The lie sounds so good because it appeals to a certain half of that dividing line that Viktor Frankl talked about. It speaks to certain inclinations within our hearts, or even speaks to legitimate good, like diversity, equity, inclusion. There is a liberal meaning to those words. There's a liberal way to implement them. And then there's an illiberal way to implement them. Marxism and Stalinism, Leninism, all sought to achieve equality through specific means. And they were disastrous and murderous as a result. So the words are, the definition of words are changing underneath us. Someone said, we're using the same words, but a different dictionary. And so people get caught off guard because they think, oh yeah, diversity, equity, inclusion, justice. But they don't understand there's a different definition now being used.
Yes. Well, and that most virtues at some point become a vice. The virtue of compassion.
Every virtue becomes a vice. It is, that's Aristotle.
Exactly.
Aristotle says there's an exact way to do it. Anything to the right or the left is a vice. And that's what he called them. He called them vices, and they're excesses or deficiencies. Every virtue has 1,000 ways to be a vice. There's only one right way for it to be virtuous. Incredible. Equality is another, let's look at the word equality, for example. Equality, that word, under classic liberalism, means equality under the law. You can't kill someone, you can't take their stuff. Rich or poor, everyone is subject to the same laws. Equality under progressivism or progressive liberalism is equality of opportunity, which means we can take from other people if it's for the purpose of equalizing their opportunity, which sounds wonderful. As long as we're equalizing their health, as long as we're equalizing their education, as long as we're equalizing their housing, we've got to give everyone an equal starting point, and we can use coercive force to do so. That is equality under progressivism. Now, equality under identity Marxism or radical identitarianism is equality of outcome. We all have to end up in the same place. It's not just good enough to start in the same place. We have to end up in the same place. And so now we're going to try to, through coercive force, right all of history's injustices. Let's do reparations. Let's take money from people who never had slaves and give it to people who never were slaves. We've got to right all the wrongs of the past. There is no Jesus who's going to right all the wrongs of the past. That's our job, for example. And so we've got to use the law, the coercive power of the state, to right all wrongs. And equality means equality of outcome. So even the word equality changes depending on which religion or philosophy you're coming from, and you have to discuss. And you have to understand the differences and the possible chinks in the armor of each.
Incredible. This is so, I love this stuff. This is exactly what I'm going to have you on, because I love hearing from you. Thank you for the price you've paid to learn this stuff, and your passion and desire to share it. What do you see coming in the next few years? Just with what you've studied and what you see happening so rapidly now. And interestingly, not just in one society, but it's having global impact. What do you see in the next few years?
It depends on where you're talking in the world. Of course, I'll speak to, and you might have some, observations of the places you've lived. I'll speak for the United States. Fortunately, there is still power in the people. People can make a difference. One of the analogies I like to use is that of a watertight ship. Once upon a time, the hull of a ship, you got one hole in it and the whole thing would flood. So they decided, we're going to put watertight doors in our hull so that if a torpedo or a log or whatever pierces one part of our hull, it doesn't flood the entire ship. The separation of powers doctrine that the founders of our country created creates a honeycomb of power separation of watertight doors within the ship of state, the ship of the American state, so that if you have a bad president, or you have a bad Alabama, or you have a bad judiciary, or you have a bad, it's like they actually built it with the intent that, if we get the worst people into all of the offices, it gives people the time to recognize what's going on and get them out, because there's only so much they can do because of all the separations of power. What we have been systematically doing.
Intact? Do you think that's still intact?
They're not. That's the problem. Under progressivism, they've started to open the watertight doors between the powers because they wanted to do good, and they needed to have. So you've got executive branches, or not branches. You've got executive, administrative, ABC, like the Department of Education, FBI, where they are executor, legislator, and judiciary all in one. It's the separation of powers is lost.
Yeah.
You've got tax courts run within the IRS infrastructure. It's like, wait, where's the separation? It's the same people being paid by the same paycheck. Where's the separation? So separate, there's so much that was supposed to be handled at the state level that is now handled at the federal level. So those separations of power have been greatly damaged. It makes change so much more difficult. But it is still possible. There are still enough of them that if enough people were to learn and decide, I see the flaws in the current how we're trying to do things, it could still be fixed. But that to me is the question. It's like it's still possible if enough people study, learn, band together, work together. The question is, will we?
Wow, man, that idea right there, I was like, well, historically,
we haven't done it.
A lot of optimism for people getting the education they need.
Maybe, I know we're coming up on our time, but maybe I'll close with this analogy, this story. You've probably heard hanging by a thread. Our Constitution's hanging by a thread, or things like hanging by a thread. That's a saying, and it originates with Damocles, the story of Damocles, which back in Greece. He was a young upstart, wanted power, wanted authority, wanted to rule. And so I think it was Dionysus, I might get the story wrong, but Dionysus said, "Come here, Damocles, let me invite you to this grand feast that basically embodies the life that you want to live, of wealth, of honor, of prestige, of ruling." And he sat him on his throne, on his own throne. So Damocles was sitting in the throne of Dionysus, and there was spread before him this beautiful banquet, and all the people that he wanted to suck up to him, and he wanted power over, were all there. But suspended over the throne and over Damocles was a sword by a single thread. Ooh. And he said, "Damocles, you can stay here and you can have all of this, but you've got this over your head. Or you can go out and you can earn it and learn the lessons that come through earning it, and then have it." And the analogy is that all of us are Damocles sitting in that throne. We have all of the abundance, all of the prosperity, the bridges, the airplanes, the technologies that was built by others. The throne room, filled with bounteous, that was built by others, and we want it, but we don't want to do the hard work. We want to sit on the throne without having done the hard work. We have to go do the hard work. That hard work has to be done by every generation. We have to understand what this thing of happiness is. Aristotle wrong? Did he get it wrong? Did he get the idea of justice wrong? Did he get the idea of character wrong? Did he get the idea of pleasure wrong? Did he get the idea of happiness wrong? Of justice, of reason? Did Cicero, who built on Aristotle and then espoused or talked about true law and what true law is, that there's this law outside of humans that human law has to be aligned with this true law that exists outside of humans, just like gravity is a law that exists outside of humans. There's a law of human, there are laws that govern the affairs of man that exist outside of man. And if you pass a law that's contrary to it, that law is not valid. That was, I think it was Cicero. Was he wrong about that? Can we just make whatever laws we want? Or is the Declaration of Independence right, which says, if your law violates true law, I, as a sovereign individual, have the right to overthrow it and institute new governments for my safety and protection. Wow. That's the whole, and even the thing that we started talking about, the whole idea of the Declaration of Independence, that there are inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Where did Jefferson, really Franklin probably, because Jefferson put in property, life, liberty, and property. Where did property come from? Aristotle, one of the things that, 4 elements of a complete life, but the only one of the 4 that government could really ensure. Government can ensure happiness, it can ensure wisdom, it can ensure judgment, but it can protect property. So that's what Jefferson said, but then I think it was Franklin came along, they're not sure, but he said, don't put property, do the highest good, which is the pursuit of happiness. That's what is our inalienable right. And that comes from Aristotle. Anyway, but if you go ask people what is happiness, they're not going to talk about virtue. They're not going to talk about character. They're going to say, well, for you, it might be golfing, and for you, it might be gardening, and for you, it might be like, no, you got to understand, gardening and golfing might be an element to it, but it's not the primary structure.
Exactly. Oh, Gary, this is awesome, man. I love all this stuff. Okay. Where can they get more from you? Tell us about your podcast, your blog. Where can people
thank you. Culturestack.online is where I muse, infrequently, but I try to put it out there. So culturestack.online is my blog, and you can look up Culture Stack on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, and other sources, Anchor. They've got a few out there, but for the most part, I'm a dad, I'm a father, I'm trying to make a living and trying to run a school is what I do during the day. And so it's like, trying to, eke away at understanding and of course, articulating takes forever, trying to write, something that, I feel is cohesive, but that's where I do it. So thanks for asking.
You're a great example of this, brother. And I have a lot of respect and admiration for you of doing all those things and yet still making this an important priority in your life to understand and share these things. And I think that's modeling for us exactly what we all need to be striving to do. But let's understand this, let's do our part, and let's be great men.
And I will say there are phases of life, when you're a newlywed with little kids in school trying to learn your trade, that might not be the time that you're going to be digging into Aristotle and stuff like that. But as soon as you have some free time, which, by the way, leisure used to mean, the word leisure comes from the word school. They used to spend their leisure time learning. Those who had leisure time spent it learning. We've turned leisure into something very different. So I want people to not feel bad, like, oh, but I'm in the middle of this with my life. It's like, there are times and seasons. There was a time and season where I was not doing this. I have 4 of my kids are out of the house. I've just got 2. I have more leisure time, and that's one of the ways I choose to spend it. And I invite others to do the same.
Yeah. And like you said earlier, I think many of us can trade some of our entertainment for education, and
yes,
make a world different in our lives.
Yes.
Awesome.
And our children and our grandchildren deserve it.
Yes, exactly. Do it for the grandkids. Yeah, for all of them. Awesome. Thanks, Gary. Appreciate it.
Hey, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much.